Cosmic Fever by Amelia Reynolds Long. This story was only ever published in the February 1937 issue of Astounding Stories magazine. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. Cosmic Fever. Pat Marsh turned at the foot of the short rope ladder that led to the opening of the gondola of the stratosphere balloon and held out his hand to little silver-haired Professor Anthony. "Well, I guess we're all set, Professor," he said with his boyish grin. "Wish me luck." "With all my heart, lad." The older man gripped the young scientist's hand fervently. Then a shadow flitted across his scholarly features. "You're sure everything's all right, Pat?" he asked anxiously. "There's no danger this time of any accident?" Pat Marsh nodded his fair head reassuringly, but there was an expression of grimness in his blue eyes. "I made another checkup just before you got here," he replied. "Everything is in perfect condition. What's more, I know definitely this time that there's nothing in the gondola except the instruments that I put there myself. If it's possible to be sure of anything in this world, I'm positive that there can be no repetition of what happened the other two times." On two former occasions, Pat had attempted to send sounding balloons into the upper regions of the Earth's atmosphere. Each of these had consisted of the usual two gas bags, a smaller inside a larger. It had been estimated that the outer bag would burst at an altitude of 60 miles, well into the nitrogen layer that exists above the stratosphere proper. When this occurred, the smaller inner bag would act as a parachute and descend gently with its attached container in which Pat had placed his newly improved set of instruments for the recording of cosmic ray activity. On the first occasion, the container had been recovered 4 days later in the prairie section of the Middle West, but when it had been opened, the records upon the drums were found charred beyond legibility, while some of the more delicate instruments were warped and twisted into uselessness. Concluding that some unforeseen accident had taken place, the American Institute of Technology, which was financing the experiment, had backed Pat in the construction of a second set of instruments and the release of another sounding balloon. But when again a mysterious fire within the 3-foot container had destroyed the records and wrecked hundreds of dollars worth of instruments, the directors of the Institute had lost patience. Such an accident could not occur twice in succession, they argued, unless the apparatus itself was at fault. Pat had protested, in vain, that his instruments had been in no way responsible for the combustion. His inventions had been condemned as impractical by the Institute's committee, while he himself had been pronounced a failure. But there had been one man who had not been satisfied with the committee's findings. Professor Roy Anthony, Pat's old friend and teacher, now head of the Institute's Department of Astrophysics, was convinced that there was more behind the mysterious fires than appeared upon superficial examination. And so, in order to prove his faith in his young protege, he had offered to privately finance the building of a third balloon for a final test. At Pat's suggestion, this one was to be different from its two predecessors. Instead of the small sounding balloon with its attached case of instruments, it was to be large enough to support a spherical gondola similar to those used by Picard and other stratosphere explorers, in which Pat himself would accompany his instruments into the upper atmosphere. This, he had pointed out, was the only possible way to discover the cause of the trouble, whether it was, indeed, the fault of the mechanism or, as one of the more sensation-loving newspapers had begun to hint, the work of some inimical outside agency. There were, the paper had observed, certain foreign governments intensely interested in stratosphere flights who might prefer to keep the field exclusively to themselves. For the following 6 months, Pat and two trusted assistants had isolated themselves in the lonely plateau land of New Mexico, where the gondola was assembled and equipped. None of the three ever left the grounds, while the only person allowed to visit them was Professor Anthony. At last came the day when all preparations had been completed, and the ascent into the regions of the superstratosphere, a height never before dared by man, was about to be attempted. With a wave of his hand to the assembled newspapermen, photographers, and newsreel cameramen at the edge of the field, Pat climbed into the gondola and drew the short ladder up after him. A kick of his foot threw over the lever that closed the heavy sliding door, sealing him in the hollow sphere. Casting a quick glance through one of the observation windows to make sure that Professor Anthony and the two workmen had got clear, he stepped to the tiny table built against the wall, and with a hand that trembled slightly, pressed the key of an electric switch box, touching off the detonation caps that were to cut loose all of the ground moorings at once, thus allowing the balloon to rise evenly into the air. The dull boom that followed was inaudible to him in his soundproof compartment, but he felt the quick tug as the four great cables parted. Then all sensation of motion vanished as the balloon shot upward into the resistless atmosphere. From the little group on the edge of the field, a lusty cheer went up, and cameras clicked madly as the great silver gas bag, with its bulging top and steeply sloping, still uninflated, lower portion that gave it the appearance of an inverted giant drop of mercury, rose higher and higher, carrying the comparatively tiny gondola with it, until, with the increasing altitude, the two dwindled into one single shining speck. For a moment that speck seemed to hover almost directly overhead, like a belated morning star. Then it vanished completely into the fathomless blue. From the observation window of the gondola, Pat Marsh saw the earth drop from beneath him, saw the panorama of plateaus, valleys, and mountain peaks spread out like a giant relief map. A moment or so he watched it, with a sort of half-fascination. Then he turned away from it to his instruments. The altimeter was climbing steadily. 1 mile, 2 miles, 2.5. Presently the light began to take on a grayish, silvery luminescence, and he knew that he was entering the Earth's ragged cloud blanket. This lasted for only a few minutes. Then, suddenly, it was gone, and vivid sunshine, almost dazzling in its brilliance, took its place. Again he looked out of the window. Beneath him spread a billowing, nebulous sea, flecked with turquoise and amethyst shadows. A feeling of tremendous loneliness swept over him. Although he had often flown above the clouds in an ordinary airplane, it had never been quite like this. It was now as though a door had been closed upon him, blotting out a familiar face. For the next half-hour or so he busied himself with his instruments. The air in the gondola was beginning to grow stale, and he turned on his oxygen tank to replenish it. The balloon was now 9 miles up, almost into the stratosphere. Already the sky had begun to grow dark, but not quite dark enough for the stars to be visible. Pat looked at his electroscope and saw that it indicated a noticeable increase in the presence of cosmic rays. Another half-hour, and he was well into the stratosphere. Glancing downward, he could discern the curvature of the earth, its edges faintly shining in the reflected light of the sun. The balloon was still rising rapidly, for although the atmosphere was much thinner, the gravitational pull of the earth was decreasing as the distance between it and the balloon increased. The gondola had now attained an altitude of 21.5 miles, higher than man had ever before ventured. The sky was taking on the familiar blue-black of night, with the stars breaking through in clustered brilliance. To the north, the Great and Little Dippers swung in their eternal march around the pole star, while against the zenith was set the mighty constellation of Orion, with the orange glory of Betelgeuse, giant of the heavens, flashing from his right shoulder. In front of him, the beautiful cluster of the Hyades marked the head of Taurus, whose red eye, the fiery Aldebaran, glowed balefully, and between and beyond these and all the other familiar sky marks, 100,000 lesser stars, ordinarily invisible to the naked eye, gleamed in lambent splendor. Pat peered through the observation window on his left and beheld the awesome phenomenon of the sun blazing in a black sky, the angry red of its chromosphere pulsating like the inflamed rim of a bloodshot eye, from which the fiery tentacles of its protuberances writhed and darted into the roseate pearl of its corona. The dazzling spectacle of that unveiled majesty was endurable only for an instant. Then he pressed his hands over his face in fear of blindness. When the brilliant after-image caused by that brief glance into the sun's dazzling face had vanished from before his eyes, he returned once more to his instruments. The leaves of the electroscope were wide apart, while the inked line on the automatically revolving drum rose steadily, indicating the continued increase of cosmic rays. The balloon had now attained an altitude of 26 miles. Outside, the temperature registered minus 134 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 50 degrees colder than the lowest temperature ever recorded on Earth. Yet, oddly enough, Pat experienced no discomfort. On the contrary, he was growing too warm. Heavy beads of perspiration were forming upon his forehead and the back of his neck. He unbuttoned his coat and removed it. For some time he had been vaguely conscious of the rising temperature inside the gondola, but he had been so engrossed by the panorama of the heavens unrolling before him that he had paid it scant attention. Now he glanced at the thermometer on the wall in front of him. It registered 96 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of an exceedingly hot summer day on Earth. "That's funny," he muttered half aloud. "It isn't possible that the absorption from the sun's rays could be so great through these heavily insulated walls." He examined the little electric heater that had been installed in case of emergency to ascertain whether it could have been turned on by accident. But no, it was not even connected. The only heat being generated inside the sphere was the practically negligible amount incidental to the running of the electric drums. He looked again from one of the observation windows, this time almost fearfully, half expecting to see some flaming giant meteor that was responsible for the condition. Yet, as he looked, his scientist's reason told him that this was out of the question. Even had it been possible for such a body to become more than faintly incandescent in this highly rarefied atmosphere, his instruments would have warned him of its approach long ago. Moreover, the meteor belt was down in the tropopause, now almost 20 miles below him. The balloon was now over 29 miles up, in the very outer fringes of the stratosphere. In another minute, it would have entered the nitrogen layer beyond. Then would come the real test of his experiment, for it was doubtful whether even the great hydrogen balloon could carry his weight and that of the gondola much farther, since, although the atomic weight of nitrogen is 14.008, while that of hydrogen is only 1.0077, the atmospheric pressure at that great height was dropping rapidly. Pat was bending tensely over his instruments. Already the degree of ascent was slowing perceptibly. The altimeter now registered 30.25 miles, while the pressure gauge indicated a swift drop from 1.84 to nearly 0.403 millimeters. He turned to the electroscope and its revolving drum, one of the most important pieces of apparatus on board, so far as the purpose of the expedition was concerned. If his calculations and those of other scientists were correct, The number of cosmic rays should now begin to increase with even greater rapidity than it had done in the stratosphere. With a feeling of exultation, he saw the line being traced on the drum scud higher and higher. Then, with a suddenness that was startling, the stylus shot almost vertically toward the top of the slowly moving graph paper. The next instant, Pat beheld drum, electroscope, everything within his range of vision, swim before his eyes in a distorting heat haze, while at the same time the air about him became like the stifling breath of a furnace. With trembling hands, he fumbled for the ripcord that opened the outer balloon, while the sweat ran in rivers into his eyes, totally blinding him. "Tell me, lad," Professor Anthony entreated as he sat opposite Pat Marsh 24 hours later in the young man's hotel room, "why did you decide to come down when you had reached only 1/2 of your intended altitude? You say nothing went wrong with the apparatus. Then what happened? Was the balloon unable to rise higher in the nitrogen layer?" Pat shook his head slowly. He was still weak and a trifle shaky, having been found unconscious inside the gondola when the balloon had drifted back to Earth. "Oh, it would have continued to go up all right," he replied. "That is," he added with a grim smile, "if it hadn't exploded on the way." "Exploded?" Professor Anthony repeated. "You mean that the outer balloon was in danger of bursting through the lessening of the atmospheric pressure? But I thought that possibility had been taken into account in the construction of the bag." "It was," Pat answered. "I didn't mean that." An expression of apprehension came into his tired eyes. "My records!" he exclaimed abruptly. "Were they all right?" "They were," the little professor assured him, "and even from my brief examination of them, I am confident that they are going to add materially to our knowledge of cosmic rays. But there was one thing about them that puzzled me. Part of the paper was slightly discolored, as if it had been exposed to heat or intense sunlight. I can't account for it." "I can." Little grim lines appeared at the corners of Pat Marsh's mouth. "It was heat, sir, heat that was increasing so rapidly that, if I had gone on, it would have caused spontaneous combustion in the gondola and exploded the hydrogen in both the inner and outer balloons, just as it did the other 2 times." "What?" The professor stared incredulously through the thick lenses of his spectacles. "Heat in what is practically outer space? But that is impossible, Pat. Why, your own temperature records showed—" "Yes, I know," Pat interrupted. "It sounds impossible, but it's true, nevertheless. We should have suspected it long ago. Why, the clue was in our hands as early as 1931, when Picard made his first ascent into the stratosphere. But I don't understand." Professor Anthony passed a thin hand through his silvery hair in a gesture of bewilderment. "You'll remember," Pat explained, "how, when Picard made that ascent, the temperature of the gondola rose so high that he had to lick drops of moisture from the inner walls to assuage his thirst. I believe this rise in temperature was explained as absorption of the sun's rays, but that was only a very small part of the real story. The true explanation lay in the very phenomenon that he was attempting to study." "You mean," the professor began, "that the cosmic rays themselves—" "Exactly," Pat nodded. "Cosmic rays are pure cosmic energy, bombarding our Earth from outer space. And energy, as we both learned in our very first course in elemental physics, is anything which, under the proper conditions, can be converted into heat. The dense atmosphere of the Earth serves to refract most of these rays, just as it does ordinary heat and light rays from the sun. But up there at a height of over 30 miles, where there was no protective atmosphere, they struck the gondola with their full intensity and, with their almost incalculable powers of penetration, passed straight through its walls. The almost pure oxygen within furnished the proper conditions for converting them into heat. "Amazing!" Professor Anthony exclaimed. "And yet, as you say, Pat, we should have suspected the truth long ago." Then his face fell. "I suppose," he said with a sigh, "that puts an end to man's explorations in the Earth's upper atmosphere, and an end to his dreams of future space flight as well." "Looks that way," Pat agreed. Then he added with a grin, "unless he can figure out some way to insure himself against the hazard of fire from beyond." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.